Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A storm on the horizon. Monica Harris adjusted her aviator scarf as she stepped onto the tarmac, her crisp uniform a stark contrast against the drizzling rain. The storm clouds overhead mirrored her apprehension, though her calm demeanor betrayed none of it. Monica was a seasoned co-pilot, her experience spanning years of navigating turbulence and unpredictable skies. She had a reputation for keeping her cool under pressure, a skill that would soon be tested to its limits. Captain Banks, her partner for this flight, was a different story. He was technically skilled but notoriously stubborn. Known for his preference to go it alone, he wasn't thrilled about sharing the cockpit with Monica. As one of the few black women in the field, Monica had faced more than her fair share of skepticism, and Banks was no exception. Monica climbed into the cockpit of Flight 219, greeted by a wall of silence. Banks didn't bother to look at her as she took her seat, his attention fixed on the flight plan. His curt nod barely registered acknowledgement. "Morning, Captain," Monica said, her voice steady. "Let's get this over with," Banks muttered, flipping switches and checking gauges. Monica didn't let his tone faze her. She had prepared for this storm, literally and figuratively. The radar displayed a sprawling mass of turbulent weather ahead, a formidable storm system spanning hundreds of miles. Air traffic control had issued advisories, suggesting alternative routes, but Banks was adamant about sticking to his original plan. "This storm's tracking east," Monica said, pointing to the radar. "We could adjust south by 20 miles. It'll add some time, but the ride will be smoother." Banks finally looked at her, his expression a mix of irritation and condescension. "We'll stay on course. I've handled worse." Monica didn't push further. She knew better than to escalate the tension before takeoff. She settled into her seat and began her pre-flight checks, her fingers moving swiftly over the controls. Outside, the rain picked up, the drops pattering against the windshield. The flight took off smoothly, the city lights below vanishing as they climbed into the cloud-covered sky. Passengers relaxed in their seats, unaware of the brewing confrontation in the cockpit. As the plane leveled off at 35,000 feet, the storm made its presence known. The turbulence began with a subtle vibration, but it didn't stay subtle for long. Violent jolts rocked the cabin, causing drinks to spill and passengers to clutch their armrests. "Level it out," Monica called over the rising noise. "I've got it," Banks snapped, gripping the controls. But he didn't have it, not completely. The plane shuddered as Banks tried to fight the winds head-on. Monica's gaze flicked to the radar, where the storm's core loomed ominously. "We need to descend slightly to avoid the stronger wind currents," she said firmly. "A lower altitude will give you more control in these conditions." Banks hesitated, his knuckles white against the controls. Pride battled logic, but the turbulence spoke louder. Begrudgingly, he nodded and adjusted the plane's trajectory. The descent was gradual but deliberate, the nose tilting downward as Monica kept a close eye on the readings. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, but as the plane stabilized, a tentative sense of calm began to take hold. For now, they were safe. But Monica knew the hardest part was still ahead. The storm's full force was yet to be reckoned with. Part 2, Navigating the Chaos. The descent brought momentary relief, but the storm was relentless. Monica's eyes remained glued to the radar, tracing the tendrils of weather patterns that seemed intent on engulfing them. "Altitude at 28,000 feet, Banks announced, his voice steadier now, but still tinged with nerves. "Hold it there," Monica instructed. Her tone was calm but commanding. "Let's see if the winds stabilize." For the first time, Banks didn't argue. He adjusted the throttle carefully, his movements precise, but noticeably cautious. Monica could sense his reluctance to fully trust her, but she focused on the task at hand. The violent jolts had lessened, the plane's path smoothing out as her strategy began to pay off. "Looks like we're threading the needle," Monica said, allowing herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Banks grunted in response, his usual arrogance tempered by the reality of the situation. He didn't say it, but Monica could tell he was beginning to see the value in her approach. The cockpit was alive with sound, chirping alerts, humming engine indicators, and the faint rumble of turbulence. Monica's hands hovered near the controls, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. She studied the swirling mass of weather ahead, her focus razor-sharp. "Looks like the worst of it is directly ahead," she said. "We can't avoid it entirely, but if we adjust west by 10 degrees. "No," Banks interrupted, his tone sharper than it needed to be. "We stay the course." Monica turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "Captain, I understand wanting to stick to the plan, but this isn't about pride. It's about safety." Banks met her eyes, his expression unreadable. The tension hung thick in the air. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Fine. 10 degrees west." Monica nodded and made the adjustments. The plane responded smoothly, the slight course correction offering a brief reprieve from the storm's fury. But as they approached the storm's core, the turbulence intensified. The plane shuddered violently, the cockpit lights flickering. Alarms blared, their shrill tones adding to the chaos. Monica gripped her seat, her heart pounding. But her voice remained steady as she called out instructions. "Throttle back. Reduce airspeed," she shouted over the noise. Banks complied, his hands moving with practiced precision. The plane groaned in protest, but held steady. Monica's quick thinking and clear commands kept them on track, but it was clear they were in for a rough ride. The storm was a living entity, its winds howling like a predator, closing in on its prey. Monica felt the weight of the situation pressing against her, but she refused to let fear take over. Her training kicked in, each decision guided by years of experience. "Stay with me, Captain," she said, her tone firm but encouraging. "We've got this." For the first time, Banks looked at her with something other than disdain. There was a flicker of respect in his eyes, a grudging acknowledgement of her skill and composure. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. The storm raged on, but Monica and Banks worked in unison, their teamwork an unspoken truce. Together, they navigated the chaos, inching closer to safety with every passing moment. Into the heart of the storm. The cockpit of Flight 219 was tense, but eerily quiet, apart from the steady hum of the engines and the faint whistle of air against the fuselage. Monica adjusted her headset, her mind working rapidly to calculate the plane's trajectory against the ever-changing storm patterns. Captain Banks sat stiffly beside her, his hands on the yoke, his eyes darting between the windshield and the instrument panel. 10 degrees west, Monica reminded, her voice calm but firm. She leaned forward, tracing the radar's display with her finger. The storm's dense core loomed ahead like a predator waiting to strike. "We'll skirt the worst of it here." Banks sighed heavily, his reluctance palpable. His fingers twitched, hesitant to make the adjustment. Finally, with a grudging movement, he complied, tilting the plane slightly left. The aircraft groaned as it shifted, the turbulent winds pushing back with fury. "We're burning extra fuel with this detour," he muttered, almost as if seeking an excuse to defy her again. Monica didn't take the bait. "Better to burn fuel than lose control. We'll request refueling accommodations if necessary. Safety first." Her measured response deflected his irritation, though she could feel the tension emanating from him. Banks was a veteran pilot, respected by his peers, but his reputation for stubbornness was as well known as his skill. Monica, on the other hand, had spent her career proving herself in an industry that rarely afforded her the benefit of the doubt. This flight was no different, except now, lives were at stake. The turbulence grew more aggressive, shaking the cabin like a rag doll. Overhead compartments rattled ominously, and faint gasps from passengers seeped through the intercom. "Fasten seatbelt signs on," Monica instructed. Banks pressed the switch without comment, his jaw tight. The radio crackled to life. "Flight 219, this is air traffic control. Be advised, radar shows severe wind shear ahead. Can you confirm your heading? Monica grabbed the radio before Banks could respond. ATC, this is 219. Adjusted course to 265 degrees. Current altitude 28,000 feet. Advise on clearing shear. Copy that, 219. Recommend maintaining current altitude. Will monitor and provide updates. Monica replaced the receiver and glanced at Banks. ATC's with us. We hold steady. Banks nodded begrudgingly, his silence betraying his internal struggle. Monica didn't have time to dwell on his attitude. The storm was intensifying, and every second demanded her full attention. The plane jolted violently, sending coffee cups skittering down aisles and causing a few muffled screams from the cabin. Monica's hands instinctively moved to the controls, her fingers hovering just in case Banks faltered. Winds are hitting 80 knots, she called out. Pitch up slightly to stabilize. Banks complied, his movements jerky but effective. The plane leveled momentarily before another gust sent it lurching sideways. Easy on the yoke. Monica snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. You're overcorrecting. I know what I'm doing. Banks shot back, his frustration boiling over. Then do it, Monica said, her tone steel. These passengers don't care about your ego, Captain. They care about landing in one piece. Her words hung heavy in the air. Banks didn't respond, but he stopped oversteering, his grip on the controls relaxing. Monica turned her attention back to the radar. The storm's tendrils were closer now, swirling masses of wind and rain threatening to engulf them. We're entering the core, she announced. Throttle back to 60%. Let the winds guide us, don't fight them. Banks hesitated, but her unwavering tone left little room for debate. He adjusted the throttle, the engine's roar softening slightly. The plane trembled but began to find a rhythm, its movements less erratic. Monica exhaled slowly. That's it. Stay with the flow. Minutes felt like hours as they navigated the storm's wrath. Lightning illuminated the clouds, brief flashes revealing the churning chaos outside. Monica's mind raced through contingency plans. What if the turbulence worsened? What if they lost engine power? Each scenario had a solution, and she was prepared to execute them if needed. Radar showing a break ahead, Monica said, her voice breaking the silence. She pointed to a narrow corridor of calmer weather. If we can reach this pocket, we'll buy ourselves time to reassess. Banks squinted at the display, his skepticism evident. That's a tight margin. It's our best shot, Monica replied. I'll guide you through. The plane groaned as another gust of wind slammed into it. Banks gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the controls. Monica leaned closer to the radar, her eyes scanning every detail. Steady, steady, she murmured. On my mark, turn 3 degrees right. The cockpit vibrated with tension, each second stretching interminably. Monica's focus was absolute, her instincts honed by years of navigating perilous skies. Now, she barked. Banks obeyed, tilting the plane slightly. The aircraft shuddered but held its course, veering into the narrow corridor of relative calm. Monica watched the radar intently, her pulse pounding in her ears. As they entered the pocket, the turbulence subsided, the violent jolts replaced by smaller, more manageable vibrations. The cockpit fell silent, save for the hum of the engines and the faint beep of the radar. Monica leaned back slightly, her hands still poised near the controls. That's better, she said, her voice softer now. Let's hold this heading and monitor the conditions. Banks didn't reply immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was subdued. You've got good instincts. Monica glanced at him, surprised by the uncharacteristic admission. Thanks, she said simply. For the first time since the flight began, the tension between them seemed to ease. Monica allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but she knew the storm wasn't over, not yet. Her eyes returned to the radar, the swirling mass of weather still dominating the screen. They had navigated the core, but the journey ahead remained fraught with challenges. Let's keep focused, she said. We're not out of the woods. Banks nodded, his demeanor less rigid. For now, they were a team, united by necessity and the shared responsibility of bringing their passengers home safely. As the storm raged on, Monica felt a renewed sense of purpose. This flight was more than a test of skill, it was a battle for respect, for survival, and for proving that calm and competence could triumph over even the most volatile conditions. And she wasn't about to back down. A battle of wills. The cockpit lights flickered as another wave of turbulence rattled the plane. The narrow corridor of relative calm they had entered minutes earlier had proven to be short-lived. Monica gripped the edge of her console, her eyes glued to the radar, while Captain Banks fought to maintain control. The storm seemed almost sentient, its violent winds and jagged streaks of lightning pressing them toward the edge of chaos. Bank left, 3 degrees. Monica commanded sharply, her voice cutting through the din of alarms. Banks hesitated, his hands frozen on the yoke. The slight delay caused the plane to jolt violently, the wings dipping unnaturally, before he finally complied. Monica clenched her jaw, biting back the urge to call him out on his hesitation. 3 degrees means now, Captain, she said, her tone measured but firm. Banks shot her a glare, his pride clearly wounded. I don't need a running commentary, Harris. This isn't about commentary. It's about precision, Monica countered, her voice unwavering. The margins in this storm are razor thin. If we slip, we don't get a second chance. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Monica wasn't just referring to their current situation. She was speaking to the weight of her own experiences, the countless times she'd had to prove her worth in an industry that didn't always value her presence. But there was no time for debates or ego now, not with lives hanging in the balance. The plane shuddered again, and the cabin lights dimmed briefly before flickering back to life. Banks adjusted the throttle, his movements more deliberate now, though his frustration was palpable. Monica studied the radar, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of swirling clouds. We've got another break in the system ahead, she announced. It's tight, but it'll give us some relief. Banks glanced at the display, his skepticism evident. And what if the winds shift before we get there? Then we adjust again, Monica said simply. But staying on this path isn't an option. The turbulence is increasing, and the wind shear is pulling us off course. Banks exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. You make it sound easy. It's not easy, Monica admitted. But it's necessary. There was a brief silence, punctuated only by the low hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. Banks finally nodded, and Monica took it as a reluctant agreement. Good, she said. Adjust heading to 240 degrees. I'll monitor the winds. As the plane veered toward the new heading, Monica's mind raced through the calculations. The storm wasn't just a test of skill, it was a battle of endurance, strategy, and trust. Every decision she made was grounded in years of training and experience, yet she could feel Banks' skepticism lingering like a shadow. I know this isn't how you planned for today to go, Monica said, breaking the tense silence. But we're in this together, and I need you to trust me. Banks didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the windshield, where flashes of lightning illuminated the dense clouds ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. It's not about trust, Harris. It's about control. When you're in this seat, every decision falls on you. Every mistake comes back to you. It's not easy handing that over to someone else. Monica considered his words for a moment before replying. I get that. But trust isn't about losing control, it's about sharing it. This isn't my first storm, Captain, and it won't be my last. Let's get through this, and then we can debate leadership styles. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Banks' mouth, though he quickly suppressed it. Fair enough. The cockpit's tension eased slightly, but the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. Monica scanned the radar again, noting the erratic shifts in wind patterns. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted something concerning, a concentrated cluster of turbulence directly in their path. "Captain, we've got a microburst forming at our altitude," she said urgently. "We need to climb." Banks frowned. "Climb? We're already pushing the upper limits of safe altitude." "I know, but it's either climb or risk being thrown into an uncontrollable dive," Monica explained. "Trust me on this." Banks hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "All right." Setting climb to 31,000 feet. As the plane began its ascent, Monica kept a close eye on the instruments, her pulse pounding in her ears. The engines strained against the turbulent winds, their hum growing louder with each passing second. The climb was steep and harrowing, but Monica's calculations proved accurate. They cleared the microburst just as it began to intensify, the plane shaking violently but holding steady. "Good call," Banks muttered, though his tone was grudging. Monica didn't respond. Her focus was already on the next challenge. The radar indicated another storm cell forming to their west, its tendrils reaching dangerously close to their adjusted flight path. "We'll need to bank hard to avoid that cell," she said. 10 degrees right, and we should clear it." Banks followed her instructions, without comment, his movements more fluid now. Monica noticed the change in his demeanor, subtle, but significant. He was starting to trust her, even if he didn't want to admit it. The storm continued to test their limits, but Monica and Banks worked together with a newfound rhythm. Every decision was a calculated risk, every adjustment a necessary compromise. The cockpit, once a battleground of egos, had become a space of collaboration and mutual respect. As they finally began to break through the storm's outer edges, the turbulence subsided, and the radar showed clear skies ahead. Monica leaned back in her seat, her muscles aching from the constant tension. "Altitude stable at 31,000 feet, Banks announced, his voice steadier now. "Winds have dropped to 40 knots. Monica nodded, allowing herself a rare moment of relief. "We're through the worst of it." Banks glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You handled yourself well back there." "Thanks," Monica said, her tone neutral. She wasn't looking for validation, but the acknowledgement felt like a small victory. Banks hesitated before continuing. "I've flown through storms like this before, but I'll admit, having a second pair of eyes made a difference." Monica met his gaze, her expression softening. "It's not about how many storms you've flown through. It's about how you approach each one. Every storm is different, and sometimes, teamwork makes all the difference." Banks gave a small nod, his demeanor less guarded. For the first time, Monica felt like they were truly on the same team. As the plane soared into clearer skies, Monica allowed herself a moment to breathe. The storm had tested her skills, her patience, and her resilience, but it had also revealed something more profound. In the face of adversity, even the most stubborn walls could be broken down, and respect could be earned where it once seemed impossible. Monica adjusted her headset and glanced at Banks. "So, Captain, what's next on our flight plan?" Banks smirked faintly, his posture more relaxed. "Next? We land this thing together." The journey wasn't over, but Monica knew they had already crossed the most important threshold. The calm before the reckoning. The cockpit was quiet now, the storm's relentless fury giving way to an uneasy calm. Monica Harris adjusted her headset and allowed herself a moment of reprieve. She leaned back in her seat, the tension in her shoulders easing as the plane cruised steadily at 31,000 feet. Captain Banks seemed similarly subdued, his hands resting loosely on the yoke. For the first time since they'd entered the cockpit together, the air between them felt less adversarial. "Looks like we've cleared the worst of it," Banks muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was less curt, though the weight of exhaustion lingered in his tone. "For now," Monica replied, her eyes still on the radar. The weather ahead looked promising, no immediate turbulence, no ominous red clusters, but she wasn't one to let her guard down. Storms were unpredictable, and she knew better than to assume the skies were entirely clear. "We should use this time to evaluate fuel levels and prepare for descent." Banks nodded, his agreement coming more naturally now. He pulled up the fuel gauge, studying the numbers. We've burned through more than expected with those course corrections. We'll need to request expedited ground services once we land. I'll handle that, Monica said, reaching for the radio. She paused, glancing at Banks. You did well back there, Captain. Adjusting to the climb and navigating through that microburst, it wasn't easy. Banks looked at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Compliments weren't something he expected, especially for Monica. Thanks, he said, his tone uncharacteristically soft. But you called the shots. I just followed your lead. Monica allowed herself a small smile. That's what teamwork looks like. It's not about who's in charge, it's about making the right calls when it matters. As they cruised toward their destination, Monica reflected on the storm they'd just survived. It wasn't just the weather, it was the storm within the cockpit, the clash of wills, and the battle for respect. She'd spent years navigating turbulence of a different kind, the skepticism of colleagues, the microaggressions, the constant need to prove herself in an industry that often overlooked people like her. Banks had been no different at first. His reluctance to trust her, his dismissive attitude, it was all too familiar. But something had shifted in the heart of the storm. She'd seen it in the way he followed her instructions, in the way his voice softened when he admitted her instincts had saved them. It wasn't a full transformation, but it was a start. You've been at this a long time, haven't you? Banks asked suddenly, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Monica glanced at him, surprised by the question. Flying? About 15 years. I started as a flight instructor before moving to commercial. Why aviation? He asked, genuinely curious now. It's not exactly a common career path. Monica hesitated, her mind drifting back to the memory that had set her on this journey. My dad was an air traffic controller, she said finally. He loved everything about planes. Used to take me to the airport to watch them take off and land. He'd explain how everything worked, the physics, the engineering, the teamwork involved. I was hooked from the start. Banks nodded, his expression softening. That explains your attention to detail. You're precise, calculated. It's impressive. Thanks, Monica said, her tone neutral. She wasn't used to receiving praise from colleagues like Banks, and she wasn't sure how to respond. What about you? Why did you start flying? Banks chuckled, a low, self-deprecating sound. Honestly? It was an escape. My family didn't have much growing up, and flying seemed like a way out. Once I got my pilot's license, I realized I actually loved it. The freedom, the challenge, it felt like the one place where I could truly be in control. Control, Monica echoed, nodding. I can see that. Her words weren't meant as a jab, but Banks flinched slightly. He looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. You're not wrong. I've always had a hard time letting go of control. It's why I've clashed with co-pilots in the past. Monica raised an eyebrow. You don't say. Banks laughed, a genuine sound that lightened the mood. Point taken. But today was different. You're different. You didn't back down, even when I pushed back. Most people just let me do my thing. Because most people are afraid of confrontation, Monica said simply. But fear doesn't save lives. Clear thinking and teamwork do. The radio crackled, pulling their attention back to the task at hand. Flight 219, this is ATC. You're clear for descent into Denver. Weather conditions at the airport are stable, winds out of the northwest at 10 knots. Copy that, ATC, Monica replied. She turned to Banks. You ready for this? Let's do it, he said, his voice carrying a note of determination. Monica took the lead, coordinating their descent with precision. The plane began its gradual descent, the nose tilting downward as Banks adjusted the thrust. The cabin hummed with activity, flight attendants securing loose items and passengers buckling their seatbelts. The descent was smooth at first, But as they approached 15,000 feet, a sudden gust of wind caught the plane, jolting it sideways. Alarms blared, and Monica's hands instinctively moved to the controls. "Crosswinds," she said sharply. "Adjust heading by 5 degrees. Keep the wings level." Banks complied without hesitation, his movements steady and deliberate. The plane stabilized, but the winds remained unpredictable. Monica's eyes flicked to the instruments, calculating their approach in real time. "We'll need to execute a precision landing," she said. "The winds are shifting too much for a standard approach." Banks glanced at her, a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "You've done this before?" "Plenty of times," Monica assured him. "But it requires absolute focus. No overcorrecting, no second-guessing." "Got it," Banks said, his grip tightening on the controls. The final approach was tense, the winds buffeting the plane as it lined up with the runway. Monica called out instructions with calm precision, her voice cutting through the noise. Banks followed her lead, his movements synchronized with hers. As the runway lights grew closer, Monica felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment where everything came together, or fell apart. "Steady, steady," she murmured. "Now flare." Banks pulled back on the yoke, and the plane's nose lifted slightly. The wheels touched down with a jolt, the landing gear absorbing the impact as the plane roared down the runway. The reverse thrusters engaged, and the aircraft slowed to a crawl before finally coming to a stop. A wave of relief washed over Monica as she leaned back in her seat. The storm was behind them, and they were safely on the ground. "Nice work, Captain," she said, turning to Banks. He looked at her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and admiration. "Couldn't have done it without you." For the first time, Monica felt the weight of the day begin to lift. They had faced the storm together, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that transcended ego and doubt. "Welcome to Denver," Monica said with a small smile. "Let's hope the ground crew is ready for us." Banks chuckled, a genuine sound that echoed in the now quiet cockpit. For the first time, he seemed at ease, not just with the flight, but with her. Grounded in truth. The aircraft rolled to a slow halt at the gate, its tires hissing softly against the pavement as the engines wound down. The once tense energy of the cockpit had been replaced with an almost surreal calm. Monica Harris let out a long breath, her muscles finally relaxing after hours of relentless focus. Captain Banks adjusted the headset on his head, his usual stoic expression replaced with something resembling gratitude, or perhaps humility. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," Banks' voice echoed over the intercom, steady but uncharacteristically warm. "We'd like to thank you for your patience during what turned out to be a challenging flight. On behalf of the crew, we're glad to have you safely here in Denver. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us today." As Banks turned off the mic, he glanced sideways at Monica. "That was for them," he said quietly. "But I owe you something more direct." Monica raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Oh?" Banks unbuckled his harness, his hands momentarily resting on the edge of the yoke. "Look, I've flown through my share of storms, and I've worked with a lot of co-pilots. But what you did today, it wasn't just good. It was exceptional. You saved us." Monica tilted her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "We saved us, Captain. It's a two-person job." Banks chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's generous of you to say, but we both know I wasn't exactly receptive at the start. You stood your ground, and you were right every time. I don't say this often, but I was wrong to doubt you." The sincerity in his voice caught Monica off guard. She had braced herself for a grudging acknowledgement, not this. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Then she leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "You weren't the first to doubt me," she said evenly, "and you won't be the last. But today wasn't about proving a point. It was about doing what was necessary. We had over 150 lives depending on us. That's what matters." Banks nodded, his expression thoughtful. Still, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, for all of it. I've been in this game a long time, but that doesn't give me the right to dismiss someone just because they approach things differently, or because I've let my own biases cloud my judgment. Monica studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. She found none. Apology accepted, she said simply. The passengers began disembarking, a steady stream of relieved faces and murmured gratitude. Monica watched through the cockpit window as the ground crew swarmed the plane, their reflective vests glowing under the airport lights. She could feel the adrenaline wearing off, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. As the last of the passengers left the plane, a flight attendant poked her head into the cockpit. "Great job up here, you two," she said with a warm smile. The passengers were pretty shaken, but everyone made it through without too much fuss. Monica nodded. "Thanks, Jill. You and the crew did an incredible job keeping things calm back there." Jill grinned. "All in a day's work. Now, go get some rest. You've earned it." Monica and Banks gathered their belongings in companionable silence, stepping out of the cockpit and into the now empty cabin. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, a reminder of the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. As they exited the jet bridge and stepped into the terminal, the weight of the day began to settle over them. Monica glanced at her watch. It was well past midnight, and the airport was quieter than usual, its halls bathed in the soft glow of fluorescent lights. "You heading straight to the hotel?" Banks asked, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent of hesitation. Monica considered the question, then shook her head. "I think I need a minute. That flight was a lot." Banks nodded. "Mind if I join you? I could use a drink, or at least a strong cup of coffee." Monica smirked. "Coffee it is. There's a 24-hour spot just down the hall." They found a small cafe tucked into a corner of the terminal, its lone barista tidying up behind the counter. Monica ordered a black coffee, while Banks opted for an espresso. They settled into a booth by the window, the airport's quiet hum providing a strange kind of solace. "You know," Banks began after a long sip of his espresso, "I've been doing some thinking. That storm wasn't just a test of skill, it was a wake-up call. I've spent so much of my career trying to prove I don't need anyone's help that I've forgotten what it means to really collaborate." Monica raised an eyebrow. "That's a big realization." "Yeah," Banks admitted. "And it didn't come easy. But watching you today, the way you handled yourself, the way you didn't back down, it reminded me of why I started flying in the first place. It's not just about control, it's about trust. Trust in the aircraft, trust in the process, and trust in the people beside you." Monica took a sip of her coffee, her expression thoughtful. "Trust isn't easy, especially when you're used to doing things your way. But it's what keeps us alive up there. That, and a healthy respect for the unknown." Banks nodded, his gaze distant. "I guess I've been holding on to this idea that admitting I need help makes me weak. But today, I realized it's the opposite. Trusting someone else, especially in a situation like that, it takes strength." Monica smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "It does. And it takes courage to admit when you're wrong." "That's rare, Captain." "Call me John," Banks said, extending a hand across the table. "After today, I think we've earned first-name basis." Monica shook his hand firmly. "Monica." As they finished their drinks, a comfortable silence settled between them. The storm had tested not just their skills but their character, pushing them to confront their flaws and find common ground. In the process, they had forged an unlikely partnership, one built not on ego, but on mutual respect. As they stood to leave, Banks, or rather, John, paused. "You know, Monica, I think we make a pretty good team." Monica smirked, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Don't let it go to your head." He laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that echoed through the quiet terminal. For the first time, Monica saw him not as the stubborn, prideful captain she'd been bracing against, but as a colleague she could rely on. They walked toward the exit together, the storm behind them and a new chapter ahead.